They say that among the forgotten mountains of a secluded village lies the convent of Santa Madalena, where time stopped and sin found refuge. Its windows, shattered by the wind, gaze like empty eyes upon those who dare to approach. The mist descending from the slopes seems to rise from the very ground of the convent, as if the earth itself were trying to hide what happened there. The old inhabitants of the region avoid speaking of the place. They prefer to cross their fingers and make the sign of the cross when the name is mentioned, as if a curse still hangs in the air. According to whispers, the sisters who once lived there had abandoned their vows of purity, surrendering to dark rituals under the veil of night. When the bell rang at midnight, it was not to call for prayer, but to announce that yet another soul would be given to the secrets of the cloister. Today, the convent is merely a shell of stone and shadows. The brush has grown over the walls, as if nature itself wishes to erase its existence. But some say that on nights when the moon is hidden by clouds, the echo of distorted chants can still be heard, coming from the depths of the chapel, as if the voices of the past refuse to silence. And then, those who feel the call or the curiosity end up climbing the forgotten path that leads to the top of the hill. Few return, and those who do are never the same. A nun named Sister Clara lived there over 100 years ago. Devout, obedient, with a serene gaze and hands always busy with the rosary, she was the portrait of piety. But there was something about her, a silence that weighed heavier than usual, a gaze that lingered on the walls, as if she saw something others couldn't. Marked by visions that no prayer could erase, Sister Clara claimed to hear the voice of the Virgin in the shadows, not in the stained glass lit by the sun, nor in the chants of the chapel, but in the cold hallways, in the whispers of the wind, in the irregular knocking of doors at night. She believed that Mary spoke to her, but not with celestial sweetness. There was supplication, pain, and sometimes a warning. The other sisters smiled with pity, then with discomfort, and finally with fear. The convent's confessor tried to expel what he called fantasies of a weary soul, but Sister Clara insisted something was coming, something that used the voice of the Holy Mother to warn. No one believed her, not until it was too late. On the last night, thunder rumbled across the mountains, and the bell rang without human hands. The sisters ran, but the convent seemed to have turned into a labyrinth. Doors led to places that didn't exist. Images of saints wept blood, and at the center of it all, Sister Clara, standing before the altar, her eyes as white as snow and a terrible expression of peace on her face. After that night, the convent was closed, and Sister Clara was never heard from again, or almost never. Some swear they still see her on nights when the fog falls heavy, praying alone in the old chapel, moving her lips in a whisper that the wind carries and which seems not to be a prayer, but a warning. The nuns disappeared, one by one, taken by something that crawled between the walls. A muffled sound, like fabric being dragged over stone, preceded each disappearance. First, it was the youngest, those who had not yet taken their perpetual vows. Then, the older, more experienced ones, the ones who claimed to have seen too much. There was never any sign of struggle, just the silence after a stifled scream, and an abandoned veil, damp with dew, or something worse. Sister Clara knew that thing hadn't come from outside. It had been called or awakened by centuries of empty prayer, of feigned faith, of secrets buried beneath the habit. She saw the shadows stretch in the moonless dawns. She felt the cold crawl beneath her robes when everyone else leapt. She knew. When she tried to warn the bishop, she was met with stiff fingers pointing to the cross and eyes hard as stone. Heresy, they said. Delirium. Possession. The pious Sister Clara, once an example of virtue, had become a threat to the sacred. And so she was locked alive in the convent's crypt the place where the bones of the old mothers lay in silence. But the silence did not last. Days later, when they opened the crypt to investigate the strange smell of burnt incense and rotting flesh, they found only the walls covered in marks. But one phrase, written in dried blood, remained clear, as if etched into the very soul of the stone. I was not the evil. I contained it. The bishop died that night, and the convent was hastily abandoned. Today, only crows in the wind dare to haunt those ruins. But they say that if anyone enters the old crypt and remains in complete silence, they may hear a prayer echoing a prayer in a calm but suffering female voice. And if that voice stops praying, run. Years after the closure of the convent, Sister Clara's story became a legend told in whispers, on occult forums, in blurry videos that claimed to show shadows on the forgotten altar. It was through this that Mariana, Raphael, Lucas, and Beatrice learned about the convent of Santa Madalena. Young, curious, passionate about mysteries, they decided to investigate the place on a moonless night, when even the stars seemed afraid to look at that place. With cameras, flashlights, and sensitive microphones, they crossed the crumbling gate. The old iron creaked as if protesting, but they pressed on. Mariana, the most skeptical, led the group. Raphael, her brother, cracked jokes to disguise his nervousness. Beatrice, introspective, carried an old journal where she wrote down symbols found in apocryphal texts. And Lucas said he had been feeling presences since he was a child. As soon as they entered, the air changed. It grew thick, still as if time itself refused to pass within those walls. The broken windows let in only shadows. The walls, stained by centuries of moisture and worse, seemed to pulse faintly. They began recording, exploring, calling for spirits, as if it were a game. But the convent was not an ordinary haunted house. It was a prison. What lived there, what Sister Clara had fought to contain, was not a ghost, nor an entity easily named. It was older than sin itself, older than scripture, older than light. A fragment of primordial darkness, hungry, intelligent, and now free. Lucas was the first to disappear, without a sound, without a trace. When the others returned to search, they found only his fallen camera and in the footage, something crawling along the walls, something that was watching them. Beatrice tried to invoke an ancient prayer, but her voice faltered as if swallowed by a sudden void. She fell to her knees, eyes rolled back, murmuring the same phrase as Sister Clara. I was not the evil. I contained it. Raphael tried to flee. Mariana stayed. Alone before the altar, she found a newly scratched inscription on the stone, fresh blood, still dripping. Now, pray for yourselves. And then the bell rang. None of them were ever found. The footage, however, mysteriously appeared on an obscure internet channel. It lasts only 7 minutes. No one who watches it to the end can sleep in the same house for more than one night. And the convent? It is still there, waiting. The convent door creaked as if it had never been opened. It wasn't a common sound, it was the groan of forgotten wood, the final sigh of something sealed away for far too long. Each inch that yielded revealed not only the interior of the building, but also a cold that didn't come from the wind, but from something that inhabited the dark. The smell flooded in immediately. Wet earth, ancient moss, and incense burned for centuries, a liturgical, dead fragrance, as if the walls were still breathing the prayers of the past. The dust danced in the air, but it was too thick to be mere dust. It had weight, memory, intent. In the silence that followed, a melody rose from nowhere. No source, no echo, no logic. A weak, irregular melody, like a distant choir praying in agony. Female voices intertwined with a corrupted Latin that scratched the eardrums of those who listened. There were no instruments, only voices many, countless, carrying a lament, that repeated like a forgotten curse. The darkness of the hallway seemed to move to the rhythm of the chant, as if obeying it. Every step taken inside was a transgression. The floor creaked beneath their feet, but not like old wood. It was like bones. Bones that had never rested. And the melody, it was drawing nearer. Or perhaps it was the opposite. The walls were covered in Latin inscriptions, scratched by human nails uneven, trembling, as if each letter had been torn from the flesh along with the sanity of the one who wrote it. Repeated phrases, crying out for mercy, for light, for silence. Others darker, seemed like inverted prayers, desperate calls for entities that should not have names. The main hallway opened before them, like the mouth of a cathedral in ruins. The stones of the floor, damp and uneven, seemed to pulse beneath their steps. The air was thick, almost liquid, and each breath came with effort, as if the place itself were trying to stop them from proceeding. It was then that they saw it. A black veil, long, dense, dragging along the floor as if floating above reality. It moved slowly, as if it knew it was being watched. Its texture was heavy, like the old linen of ecclesiastical habits, but wrapped in something darker. Like living soot, when the flashlight's beam reached it, it disappeared. It didn't run. It didn't dissipate. It simply was no longer there, as if it had never existed, or as if it were just out of reach of the human gaze, waiting to be seen again at the right moment. Beatrice let out a whisper. Veniet te custodiet, no one knew what she meant. Not even she. Lucas felt something touch the back of his neck, but when he turned, there was only darkness. Mariana clutched the rosary she had found on the floor warm, as if someone had still been holding it moments ago. And from the depths of the hallway, the melody returned. Louder. But now there was a solitary voice over the choir. Feminine, firm, and familiar, whispering something between the notes. I contained it. Mariana stepped away from the others, drawn to a broken stained glass window that caught her attention. The image of the Virgin, which seemed to be the same as always, now displayed something unusual. Her eyes, once soft and serene, seemed fixed on her, and the smile, normally so subtle, appeared wider, almost enigmatic. She approached slowly, camera in hand, trying to capture the beauty of the scene, but the sensation that washed over her was strange. The stained glass, despite the passage of time and dirt, seemed to emanate a peculiar energy. The light from the lantern reflected off the glass pieces, casting shadows that danced on the stone floor, and the figure of the Virgin seemed to follow her movements, as if aware of Mariana's presence. As she reached out to touch the glass, a slight but unsettling pain coursed through her palm. Looking at her hand, a thin scar, as if scratched by something invisible, slowly appeared on her skin. Before she could even understand what was happening, the reflection of her hand in the glass began to show something even more disconcerting. Blood began to flow from her image, as if being spilled by something beyond her control. Stunned, Mariana pulled her hand back, and the reflection on the glass remained, as if something was reacting to her presence. The Virgin's smile in the stained glass, which now seemed more distant, continued to watch her with an expression that mixed serenity and a touch of mystery. But what disturbed her most was the fact that, even after pulling away, the feeling that something was watching her did not fade. She stepped back, trying to push away the unsettling thought that enveloped her. The blood that had spilled from her reflection now disappeared, but the sensation that something beyond the physical was at play lingered with her, like a presence lurking, waiting in the dark. The heavy silence of the convent seemed to envelop everything, like an impenetrable blanket. Mariana and the others moved cautiously through the corridors, their lanterns illuminating the cold, stained walls. The air was dense, filled with an almost tangible tension, as if the place itself were watching them. Each step made the echo of the environment drag, as if time there was stagnant, frozen in a distant moment. Then they heard it. A soft voice, murmuring, almost inaudible, but clear enough to be understood. "You came to free her." Those words floated in the air, but there was no one nearby. They stopped abruptly, eyes turning in all directions, searching for any sign of who might have spoken, but there was nothing but shadows. The hallway was empty as before. The silence, however, now seemed thicker, more threatening. Mariana was the first to approach, the lantern in her hands trembling slightly. The sensation of being watched intensified with each passing second. But as they neared the end of the hallway, a hooded figure appeared in her peripheral vision, in a dark corner. The figure stood still, its presence almost ethereal, as if it were a living shadow. The black habit, dirty and torn, seemed to float in the space. But before they could react, the figure vanished, as if it dissolved into the shadows. In the place where it had been, only the black habit remained, lying on the floor, and a circular stain on the ground, like a cell of fresh blood, dark, thick, as if it had been left there intentionally. The four young people stood in silence, trying to process what they had just seen, or rather, what they hadn't seen. The smell of iron in the air was strong, almost nauseating, but the strangest thing was the feeling that the stain on the floor wasn't an accident, but a mark. A mark left for anyone who dared to approach. Who was speaking? And what did they mean by free her? Mariana swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the lantern as a chill ran down her spine. That presence or what had been still lingered in the air, as if they were being watched by something or someone waiting for a movement, a misstep. When they tried to leave, something was deeply wrong. The convent, which had once seemed simple and decaying, was now a senseless labyrinth. The doors that once led to familiar corridors had disappeared, leaving only empty walls where there was no exit. The windows, which had once opened to the courtyard, now opened to endless hallways, as if the very physical space of the convent had been twisted by an invisible force. The air was dense and heavy, as though the place itself were closing in on them, slowly swallowing them. This isn't possible," murmured Raphael, his voice trembling as he pounded his fists against the wooden door that should have led them to the exit. But it simply wouldn't give way, and seemed to disintegrate under his hands. The shadows in the depths of the corridors seemed to stretch and bend, as if they were gaining a life of their own. Beatrice tried to look through a window, but the sight that awaited her was even more terrifying. Outside, the night would not pass. There were no stars, no moon. It was as if time had completely stopped, suspended in an endless wait. When she stepped away from the window, her footsteps echoed on the cold floor of the corridor, but there were no longer the usual sounds of an old building. The sounds were muffled, as if the very essence of the convent had distorted. And then they heard a distant knock, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was the sound of the tower clock, the same clock they knew had been broken for decades. It had stopped long ago, but now, somehow, it was working again. And the most terrifying thing was the direction in which the hands were moving, backward. The ticking that had once sounded regularly was now a strange echo reverberating through the convent, each reversed tick bringing with it a feeling that something was being undone, as if time itself were being reversed. "It doesn't make sense," said Mariana, her eyes widening as she looked at the clock turning unnaturally. Time is going backward." The ticking grew louder, more incessant, as if it were speeding up. The air felt denser, and the walls began to pulse. The space around them was compressing and expanding, as if the convent had a life of its own and was reacting to their presence. Each movement now seemed to be followed by distortions. The shadows stretched out, and the doors that had disappeared reappeared in impossible places. The convent, once a familiar place, was now an endless prison, a labyrinth with no way out, where the rules of time and space no longer applied. The tower clock continued to turn backward, and with it seemed to come the weight of the past and something else. something dark waiting for them. Time in the convent seemed to drag on, yet at the same time, it accelerated in an unsettling way. Every step they took, every movement, seemed to pull them further away from any chance of escape. The clock in the tower continued to turn backward, its ticking echoing like a beacon guiding something terrible, but invisible. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. Lucas was the first. He was standing before an old mirror in a narrow corridor, his hands trembling as he watched his reflection. It was as if the glass, dirty and fogged, was calling him back. When he drew closer, something happened. Lucas's reflection smiled, but it was not the same smile he knew. It was a distorted, grotesque expression that sent a chill down his spine. Before he could pull away, an invisible force yanked him into the mirror. His screams were muffled, and the glass seemed to swallow his form, as if he were being consumed by the surface itself, disappearing where nothing else seemed real. Beatrice, who was further behind, screamed. She ran toward the spot where Lucas had vanished, desperate to find him, but the ground beneath her feet suddenly opened, like a rift in space itself. She tried to hold on, but it was too late. She fell, as if the convent had decided that none of them would escape. When she fell, she did not land on the floor, but on something far more macabre. What revealed itself before her eyes was an inverted chapel, a grotesque parody of sanctity. The altar was upside down, and the walls were covered in shadows that moved unnaturally. The sight was repulsive. Monks, or what remained of them, were lined up around the chapel, their robes rotted away by decaying flesh, their faces disfigured, eyes hollow. They sang, but not hymns of holiness. The sound was a distortion of words, an inversion of prayers. Inverted psalms, sung with a voice that seemed to come from beyond death. That sound reverberated through the walls, penetrating her mind, making her feel small and insignificant. It was as if the words, once sacred, were now poison, a curse. The floor, which had once seemed solid, now rippled, as if it were alive, responding to Beatrice's presence. She stood, but before she could scream or try to escape, a dark shadow emerged from the walls, enveloping her with a crushing force. Meanwhile, Mariana and Raphael, still in the corridor, felt the change in the air, the weight, the foreboding. Screams, echoes, distortions. They ran, but with every step, the convent seemed to reconfigure itself, as if it were moving consciously, preventing their escape. And the time, that cursed clock, continued to turn backward. Deep down, they knew they were nearing something final, something the convent had kept hidden for a long time. But what could that something be? What awaited them in the shadows? Raphael and Mariana finally reached the underground library, a place that seemed beyond the reach of time. The air was cold and heavy, thick with the smell of aged paper and mold. The atmosphere was stifling, almost as if the place itself had been sealed for years, forgotten by all, until they stumbled upon it. The shelves were filled with dusty books, many with worn covers and stained pages. But Mariana's gaze was drawn to something specific, a table in the center of the room, covered by a heavy black cloth. Beneath it, an ancient wooden box was half open, and as they approached, an unsettling feeling overtook them. It was Raphael who lifted the cloth, revealing a diary, yellowed with age, but still exuding an aura of mystery. The name Sister Clara was inscribed on the cover, in fine, almost faded letters. It was the diary they had been searching for, the testimony of everything that had happened in the convent, the key to understanding what, in fact, awaited them. Mariana, with trembling hands, opened the pages. As her eyes scanned the words, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The first pages spoke of Clara's devotion, her unwavering faith, but something in the details began to shift. As they moved forward, the tone of the words grew darker, more desperate. The last pages, still damp to the touch, were torn and stained with something dark, perhaps blood, perhaps something else. Mariana read aloud, almost whispering, as Raphael drew closer. His eyes also fixed on the diary. The angel fell. His fall was my sacrifice. I found him in the depths, in the darkness that hid between the stones of the convent. He was not an angel of light, but a shadow that corrupted everything around him. He was sealed, trapped in the foundations, where his essence remains. But he is not dead. He will never die. And I gave my soul to keep him trapped, so that the evil he represents would never be set free. The words were visibly rushed, as if Clara had been writing under unbearable pressure, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what she had done. I sacrificed my soul to keep the seal intact, but what I didn't know was that the darkness itself was feeding on me. The convent was built on the prison of the fallen angel, and now he waits. I hope someone comes to release him. When that happens, I will no longer be the guardian, but merely an echo in the void. Mariana stopped reading and looked at Raphael, her eyes filled with terror. What she had just discovered was not merely a mystery from the past, it was the explanation for everything happening there. The convent, that cursed place, was more than just a refuge for the nuns. It was a prison, and what was trapped there was no ordinary creature. It was a fallen angel, and the seal, which had been kept intact for over 100 years, was now weakening. Whatever had happened in the convent, whatever was moving in the shadows, was connected to this. The angel, or what was left of him, was waiting. They had awakened something they could not control. And now they were inside, with the darkness lurking, knowing that their only choice was to face what Clara had sealed, or disappear like all the others. Mariana was in shock, her eyes fixed on Sister Clara's diary, her hands trembling as the words repeated in her mind. The truth, cruel and devastating, was starting to form before her. Clara was the seal, not the monster, she murmured, her voice trembling, as if each word was an unbearable weight. Tears began to roll down her face, but she didn't blink, as if she couldn't tear her eyes away from what she had just discovered. We set her free. Raphael, standing beside her, seemed to not fully understand, but he felt the same pressure tightening in his chest. He looked at her, the words still echoing in his mind. Somehow they had freed Clara, the nun who had sacrificed herself to keep the fallen angel trapped deep within the convent. She wasn't just a guardian. She was the seal itself, the key that kept the evil from escaping. But as they read those final words, something broke inside them. By touching the diary, by opening the past, they had shattered the barrier. Clara was no longer there to keep it contained. The fallen angel, the dark and ancient being, was free to rise again. The air around them grew heavier, denser, as if the very structure of the convent was closing in on them. The silence, which had seemed absolute, was now being interrupted by something sinister. Suddenly, a low, distant sound began to echo through the walls of the crypt, a sound that seemed to come from far away, but at the same time, from within each stone, each crack. It was the sound of bells ringing, but there were no bells here. There was no visible source, nothing that could produce the sound. Yet it grew louder, intensifying, as if the bells were drawing closer, as if they were being rung by invisible hands, echoing through time itself. Doom, doom, doom. Each strike seemed to carry the weight of centuries of imprisonment and curse. The sound reverberated through the stone walls, and with each toll, the ground seemed to tremble faintly, as if the crypt was awakening. The air grew cold, and the sense of presence, of something drawing near, intensified. Mariana and Raphael looked at each other, terror beginning to spread through their bodies. Clara's voice, or whatever remained of her, still echoed in their minds. I was not the evil. I contained it, but now the evil was free. The bells continued to toll, each sound louder, more urgent. They were not just bells, it was a summons, a call. And at the far end of the crypt, something responded. The crypt's floor trembled with a supernatural force, as if the very ground was revolting against the invaders who had broken the seal. The sound of the bells, now deafening, reverberated in all directions, while the air seemed to thicken, making breathing almost impossible. And then the voices began. At first, a low whisper, like a distant wind. But soon, the whisper transformed into screams, and the screams turned into a chaotic cacophony of words and languages no human could comprehend. They flew throughout the space of the crypt, and they were not mere echoes. They were voices that crossed time, reverberating with the pain and evil of distant eras. Each word seemed to vibrate through the walls, as if those ancient languages were marks of something primordial, something that existed before humanity itself. Mariana and Raphael were paralyzed, unable to move a muscle, as the crypt became a prison of sounds and darkness. The ground trembled, and a putrid smell of decay and darkness filled the air, causing their lungs to burn with each breath. It was as if the convent itself was collapsing around them, but not by the hands of time, rather by the presence that had risen from the depths of the earth. From the ground, something began to emerge. At first, it was just fissures in the stones, small cracks, as if the very foundation of the convent was being opened from the inside out. But soon, these cracks began to expand, forming a large rift from which an eerie and unnatural light emerged. But this light was not pure. It didn't shine like a star, nor did it illuminate clearly. It was a decaying light, distorted as if it were dying as it appeared. It was a light that shouldn't exist, a light that was both an abyss and a flame, something that defied all logic and human understanding. And then the true form was revealed. It was not Clara. It was not the nun who had sacrificed herself. It was not the seal. What rose from the ground was no longer a being of flesh and blood, but an entity that transcended any human concept of existence. It had a form, but it was not one that could be described in words. Its wings, which unfolded with a macabre snap, were made of twisted and fragmented bones, as if they were the remains of something long forgotten for millennia. Each beat of the wings made the air vibrate, and the room seemed to shrink with every movement. Its eyes were black holes, like portals to absolute nothingness. There were no pupils, no glow, just infinite darkness. And as they looked into those eyes, it was as though Raphael and Mariana's very beings were being sucked into an endless abyss, as if their souls were being consumed, piece by piece. The entity fully rose, and its presence was overwhelming. There was no sound, no screams, just a constant pressure, a feeling that the world was warping around them, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn. It looked at them, but not with human eyes. Its black holes didn't seek to understand, nor to love. They were beyond that. They were the void, the end. And the silence that followed was worse than any sound. It was the silence of the end. Mariana fell to her knees, her trembling fingers clutching Sister Clara's diary against her chest, but her mind was beyond the reach of reason. Something took hold of her from within, an irresistible force that made her mouth move, but not with her own words. She didn't know what she was saying, but her tongue repeated a prayer she had never learned, ancient words that sounded like a funeral chant, a lament from lost times. The prayer came from somewhere deep inside her, as if the earth itself, the convent itself, was dictating what she should do. "Hail, Lady of Darkness," the words left her mouth, carrying a supernatural weight, as if her soul was being consumed with each syllable. The words flowed uncontrollably, and the space around her seemed to distort. The sound of ancestral voices, still reverberating through the crypt, seemed to grow louder with each repetition, a sinister melody blending with Mariana's prayer, as if everything was merging into one desperate scream. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't. Raphael, on the other hand, was paralyzed by the vision before him. He tried to move away, to flee from the unbearable presence that was growing behind him, but his feet wouldn't respond. He looked back, and then a sense of absolute terror gripped him with overwhelming force. Before him, in one of the shattered stained glass windows that had once appeared as a distant landscape, now stood his own image. But it was no longer him. He was dressed in a black habit, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes empty, dark like the holes of the entity that was watching them. His own eyes, the ones he knew, had now been replaced by something far worse, an absence, an absolute void. Raphael stepped back, his breath quickening, but the stained glass window continued to reflect the figure that was no longer his. The man in the dark habit stood there, immortalized in the broken glass, his empty eyes fixed on him. There was no expression on his face, but the feeling of being watched by a being that did not exist, that should not exist, was crushing. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The stained glass was like a distorted mirror, reflecting something Raphael couldn't comprehend, the idea that he was no longer who he thought he was. His identity was being stolen, fragmented, taken by the shadows that stretched around him. Mariana was still on the floor, her voice now becoming a frantic repetition, the words growing more and more uncontrolled, as if something was completely possessing her. The prayer was no longer a prayer of pleading, but an invocation. She was calling something, or something was calling her. And the stained glass window, now cracked, reflected the truth. They were lost. There was no escape anymore. There was no salvation. The entity, with its bone wings and eyes of the abyss, was finally complete. And they, with their paralyzed bodies and broken souls, were the chosen ones to witness the end. Raphael tried to move, tried to scream, but his body was paralyzed. His eyes were fixed on the image in the broken stained glass window, where his own figure, wearing the dark habit, watched him in a distorted reflection. Fear consumed him, but there was something else, something deep that touched his soul with the force of a fate he could not escape. Then the voice spoke. It was not a sound coming from a physical place, but a presence that invaded his mind, cold and sharp like a blade. It was an ancient voice, one that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of forgetfulness and suffering. "You are blood of the lineage that betrayed Clara," the voice said, and each word sounded like an echo, reverberating against the walls of the crypt, inside Raphael's very flesh. "It was necessary for you to return to break the seal." The words pierced him like needles to his heart. A revelation, a dark truth he had never imagined. He who had thought himself just a stranger in an ancestral nightmare, now understood. He was not just an intruder. He was part of something much larger, a lost lineage, a family marked by a betrayal that stretched back to distant times. The lineage that somehow had broken the pact Clara had made. He, unknowingly, was the bearer of the curse that had sealed the fate of everyone there. He had been brought back, not by chance, but to complete the cycle, to free what should have remained bound. And as he tried to process the words, an even more terrifying sensation took hold of him. Invisible hands began to encircle him, touching his skin in a cold, almost ethereal way. He tried to move away, but his limbs were immobilized, his body unresponsive. These hands, made of shadows and despair, dressed him in something he did not recognize. The ancient habit, heavy and cold, adjusted to his body with an eerie precision. It was a monk's habit, but not just any monk's. It was the habit of a traitor, of someone who had sealed a fatal destiny. The ancient fabric, marked by time, seemed to absorb his very essence, as if it had been connected to him from the moment he was born. He could feel the weight of history on his shoulders, the weight of Clara, the weight of the lineage that had betrayed him. He wanted to scream, to fight, but something held him back. His hands, now dressed in the habit's sleeves, hung heavily at his sides. The sensation of being consumed by his own heritage was overwhelming. He could no longer see himself as the person he once was. He was a reflection of the past, a fragment of the betrayal that had led them to this moment. Tears began to flow down his face, uncontrollable. There was no sound, just the deep silence of the crypt, the muffled sound of a man lost in his own history. He wept in silence, not only out of fear, but because of the feeling of being part of something irrevocable, something that he could not change. The lineage that bound him to the convent, to Clara, and to the curse that now consumed him was stronger than any resistance. And as he bowed under the weight of that truth, the sound of the bells continued to ring, distant yet present, like a call that could not be ignored. He knew there was no turning back. He was now marked, sealed by the lineage and by the entity that waited. When the sun finally rose, a cold, pale light touched the convent, illuminating the desolate scene. The air, which had once been heavy with unbearable tension, now seemed to be in absolute silence. The shadows of past nights dissipated, but what remained was something even more disturbing. The convent was in ruins again, as if nothing had happened, as if time had been reset. The walls, now worn by the erosion of time, were covered with moss and lichens. The stone floor, once solid and sacred, was now cracked, with fragments scattered like scars of a place that should never have been touched. But there was no sign of life. There were no traces of the young people who had entered the convent with hopes of uncovering its secrets. Mariana, Raphael, Lucas, Beatrice. They had all disappeared. There were no signs of where they had gone, nor any proof of their struggle or resistance. The silence was deep, almost impenetrable. Then something caught attention. In front of the altar, 4 candles were lit. The flames danced gently, without wind, but with a peculiar energy, as if the candles were there for a specific purpose. They formed a perfect circle, like a ritual still in progress, though the participants were no longer present. The gaze of anyone observing would be immediately drawn to a broken stained glass window, where the morning light illuminated an unexpected scene. In the broken glass, a new painting was revealed. It hadn't been there before. It couldn't have been. In the painting, Sister Clara was depicted, but now she was not the tormented and sacrificed figure of the past. She was at peace, a serene smile on her lips, as if she had finally found the rest she had sought. Her eyes were calm, and her expression, once filled with pain and suffering, now displayed an almost celestial kindness. And at Clara's feet, kneeling in reverence, was Raphael. But not the Raphael who had entered the convent, the tormented and lost man, but a new Raphael, one who seemed to finally be at peace. The black habit he wore was now impeccable, his eyes calm, as if he were part of the painting, part of Clara's destiny. His expression was serene, without the anguish he had carried through the previous nights. It was as though the cycle had been completed. The crypt, the entity, the seal. Everything now seemed to have come to its end. The convent was calm, but the weight of transformation was clear. The young people had vanished, but their fates had been sealed, written in the shadows that were now dissipating. Clara, who had been the seal and the prison, was now at peace, and Raphael, the last descendant of the lineage that had broken the pact, was there, at Clara's feet, now part of her story, part of what he had always been destined to be. The convent, once sacred, was now a place of rest and end, where the lost souls had found their place. The sun shone over the ruins, but the true darkness had already been released. And in the lit candles, in the marks that remained, there was still a reminder that destinies had been fulfilled. No one would challenge the convent anymore. It was the end, or perhaps just the beginning of something more. The villagers who once ventured up the hill still avoid the path to this day. The ground where the convent of Santa Maddalena once stood remains untouched, covered by dense, wild vegetation, as if the land itself sought to hide what happened there. The elders, their eyes heavy with wisdom and fear, murmur about the horrors that were unearthed in that forgotten place, but no one dares to confirm. On moonless nights, when the wind blows strong and the trees sway with a distant lament, a strange sound can be heard in the distance. It is a solitary bell, ringing with a melancholy that seems to transcend time. A bell that should not be ringing, for there is no one left to ring it. But there it is, resounding in the silent hours of the night, like a call, like an echo of something that cannot rest. At first, the villagers thought the sound came from some lost relic, from an object still bound to the convent. But when they approach the hill, they find nothing but ruins and darkness. The bell, however, does not fall silent. And after the sound, something else resurfaces, whispers, faint and almost imperceptible, drifting through the air, like voices without bodies. The words are unclear, but the sense that something is waiting, something that watches and waits, is undeniable. It is no longer the nun who haunts the place. Sister Clara, with her devotion and sacrifices, no longer exists among the dead. She who sealed the dark truth is now at peace, far from the convent, far from its decaying walls. But what she sealed, what she imprisoned deep within that place, is another story. And that evil, that being, is now free, free to stretch through the shadows, free to haunt those who dare to come too close. What the nun kept imprisoned for so long now wanders the ruins, an entity that knows no mercy. That which she feared, that which she sealed with her soul, is waiting, not in haste, but with a patience that exceeds human understanding, waiting for another curious soul brave enough to open the door that, to this day, remains locked. And while the villagers avoid the hill, certain that the ancient stories are more than just mere legends, the bell still tolls. The evil that was freed waits, and the shadows, which never fully dissipated, continue to move at the edge of the light, as if they know the next lost soul is closer than one might think.